My name is Era, and I'm the host of the Tamil Creator Podcast. I chat with creators from all over the world to share their stories and discuss hot topics in a way that I hope inspires, educates, and entertains you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Tamil Creator. This is your host, and today I have not only one guest, but I have two, which is unusual for me. The two guests that I have on today are Manjula Selvarajah and Kirthana Sasitharan. So Manjula, a lot of you might know her. She's well known in the Tamil community. We had a conversation just before this where she was trying to downplay her accomplishments, and we're not going to let her do that. So Manjula is a Toronto-based journalist, technology and education columnist with segments airing for CBC stations nationally and a guest host on CBC's Ontario shows. She's also a frequent MC and moderator with repeat speaking appearances at Elevate, Collision, and hashtag Move the Dial. In her former life, she was a VP of marketing at a startup called Eloqua, which went on to do really well in terms of an exit. And she's also the co-founder of Tamil Women Rising and co-creator of the Boldly Asian series on CBC. Kirthana Sasitharan is a CBC News reporter and associate producer, and also Manjula's fellow co-creator on the Boldly Asian series on CBC. Her previous experiences include News Network, Marketplace, and business in Vancouver. She's also worked as a reporter in Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, Thunder Bay, and Sudbury. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I hope today's experiment with two guests goes well, but I think you guys will do awesome. So I want to thank you guys for jumping on. For me, I'm always a fan of starting at the beginning. I think I tell every guest, I think not everything, but like a lot of the choices you make as adults, whether you consciously or unconsciously are aware of it, are driven by things that you were exposed to at the beginnings when you're younger. So let's start at the beginning for both of you, and either one you can go first, but tell us about your family, your upbringing, and how that played a part in your decision to eventually become journalists and create this series called the Boldly Asian series.
Kirthana, I'm going to point to you. Because I don't think I've even ever heard you talk about this. So I'm keen to hear.
Well, I immigrated to Canada from Sri Lanka, which I'll be honest is something actually people find shocking. I don't know why, but maybe the crowd I work in here, I was like, oh, you don't have an accent. I was like, oh my God, immigration doesn't equal accent, but okay. And it was, I came here when I was like 8 months old. I was a baby, and they're like, you came here 8 months ago? Wow. I was like, wow, there's a really big loss of hearing here. Yeah, I came to Canada. I kind of had your typical Tamil livelihood, just with a twist. I would say, like, you had your dosas and puttus, but at the same time, my brother was into hockey and soccer, and we played like piano and dance, and so my parents tried to kind of tread the waters between living a very Canadian life and living a very Western adapted life. What's kind of interesting is I actually started in the performing arts. I started in music and theater. But I really had a strong interest in politics, geography, all of those things. So I went to high school for theater. When it came time to actually go to journalism school, I remember being in my guidance counselor's office, and I had 4 choices. And I remember I called my mom and I said, oh, I love journalism. She's like, you are never allowed to be a journalist. And I was like, what? She's like, they will send you to a country and you will die. I was like, what? But that was her very immediate reaction. And, for so long, I didn't understand it, but I understand where my mother grew up. Like, obviously, she grew up in a country where journalists were, they died because they were journalists. And she had a just total fear. That was not a great, she said, do anything except that. I went in to do English literature, but I love journalism. I love journalism. I love getting to the bottom of a story. I love accountability. I think accountability is very important. I love political science. I love asking questions. I'm a very curious person. So none of these things were satisfied with an undergraduate degree. By my 4th year, I had the opportunity to actually do my master's in journalism. So I went out to UBC. I got a full scholarship at UBC, and I did my master's. That actually, at that point, I think my parents couldn't say anything. Like, when you get full rides in your education, like your parents aren't going to be like, oh, well, I'm not paying for it. Like, go wherever you want. So ultimately, that's what happened. Like, I got a full ride. My dad and my mom dropped me off in Vancouver very like angrily, but they're like, oh, well, we don't have to pay for it. So, but it was really just, I was in my element. I was telling stories. I had a way to channel anger. I feel like sometimes we see injustices in this world and we just kind of feel like we can't do anything about it. I think it sits with us very heavily. I had this great opportunity here to just tell these stories. I had a great opportunity to be that voice in the middle where I just didn't want to sit still. I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to kind of open up that avenue. So then I started pursuing journalism during my master's, and I graduated and eventually found a job. So that's kind of my transition towards this field.
And just before Manjula jumps in, it's really interesting you kind of brought up how you didn't get that, like why your mom was so against you being a journalist, because I had a conversation with Suresh Das, who he was talking about an interesting theory he had about why there was no sit-down restaurants that were Tamil Sri Lankan in Toronto at the beginning. And he said, his theory was, talking to his parents, was in Sri Lanka, like like in the middle of the war, like it was never safe to sit down and kind of enjoy a meal because, you know, there could be like a bombing or just like a military attack. So it was always takeout. And then subconsciously, people brought that thinking here, and there was never any sit-down restaurants until the second generation started doing it. So it's just really interesting how these patterns or things that are ingrained in you, you don't realize where you pick them up, and then kind of you just manifest in like really unexpected places. So anyways, it's like a random thought, but I'll let Manjula jump in and share her story.
Oh, it's hard for me to figure out which story to tell, simply because my career has had all sorts of little twists, right? I would have to say that I'm going to first talk about engineering, because I do have a love of science, engineering, and technology, and for me, where that moment started was one day in electronics class. We moved from Sri Lanka to Nigeria when we were very young. And then I moved from Nigeria, after traveling back and forth to Sri Lanka, and between Sri Lanka and Nigeria, I moved from Nigeria to Canada when I was 15. But there was one particular year in a class in Nigeria, electronics class. No one had a clue what this teacher was drawing. They were apparently drawing some kind of a motor on the board. No one understood it. So I came home and I told my dad, I said, this is a motor. I have no clue. I have to memorize this. The entire class is struggling with it. And what he did is he actually took a bunch of little parts around the house, and he's an accountant. He's not an engineer or a scientist. And he actually built a little motor. And I remember the point where he connected the two wires and the thing in the middle started moving. I was blown away. It's so vivid that I still remember that. And I finally got it. I was like, that's what this teacher is trying to draw. So I went back to class and I explained it to a couple of my classmates. And then I would come home, he would build the next thing. And I became the go-to person in electronics class. People were like, you don't get it, go to Manjula. Like, I aced that class. And I think that gave me a certain amount of confidence to then think, well, this could be a possibility. I started getting more serious in math, more serious at physics. And that's where it started. And I've always been fascinated. Like, I even remember the first time I learned how planes fly and being completely mesmerized by the idea that you could use differing air pressures to move something up. So went on to get an engineering degree at Queen's University in Kingston, and from there moved on to work for a technology company. From there, a startup, which I did for several years, of very sleepless nights. And I would say I have had two phenomenal job experiences in my life. Journalism is one of them. I'll get to that in a minute. Working at that startup was the other. I learned so much. The primary thing that I learned is that I'm not so great, right? That's the first thing that a startup teaches you, is just teaches you to be really humble about knowing what you're good at and knowing what you're terrible at and focusing on the good stuff. right after I'd been at the startup for a couple of years, we were doing okay. We hadn't really sort of caught that wave to ramp up and become a bigger player, but we were making some money. Team was growing. I think we were at about 250 people at that point. I was managing their marketing team, and I took some time off to have a child, and I'll be very frank because I've spoken about this frankly before. We were having fertility issues, and my stress certainly, and the sleepless nights probably, and long days probably didn't help. Of course, that must have made a difference because 1 year later, I did have a child. And in the time that I was pregnant, just so that I needed to put all that energy somewhere, I started helping nonprofits in the Tamil community around sort of any sort of issues. If anyone wanted a press release written, if you wanted, I don't know, something, you wanted a couple of media calls done, any kind of marketing done, just get in touch with me. Got involved with one organization, and one day when there was a group, a very large group of migrants that appeared on a boat off the coast of BC, I was called upon to kind of do press releases, and that blossomed into something like 40 interviews over 5 days with journalists. I met a whole bunch of journalists. We went from the story being, who are these terrorists that are on the boat, to journalists really spending the time to understand who these people were and going, well, we don't know who they are, but we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I really learned to respect these people who knew, some of them didn't know a lot about Sri Lanka, didn't know anything about what was happening in Sri Lanka with the conflict, but very quickly understood the issue and managed to produce great work in that time. And I think it was in one of those days, there was a particular journalist, I think from CP24, who said, have you ever considered becoming a journalist? I said, I don't think so, but I think you've just converted me. And that was it. That was the journey for me. And, I think that's why Kirthana and I really get along as well. And I think a bunch of the people in our newsroom really get along, because at the core of what we want to do, it's really try to be that person that tells that story. And when it feels magical is when it's a story that usually doesn't get told. And when you come from an underrepresented community, there's a chance that you get to tell more of those stories, because you might be one of the few links that people have to media outlets. So in a very, very long way, that's how I went through my first career to now my second career, which again, I said, I'm blessed to have a second place that I've ended up in that I love.
That's great. I don't think I've heard that version of the story. I think a couple of funny stories about, not funny, but I guess interesting stories is, I think I met you around that time because, speaking of like failures, I'd done my first startup, which failed miserably, but I think I just met you at this event. I approached you because I think you were speaking. I was amazed at like how well of a speaker, or how well you spoke. And I think you invited me to some like fundraiser. I showed up and I won like the $200, I think, cash prize, and I donated it. People were like upset at me for like donating it because I set the precedent for anybody who wins this money moving forward must donate it. So I remember that story. The second thing is, it's like something about the 2 degrees of separation in the Tamil community versus like the 6, because you went from you moved to Nigeria, and like who else could I possibly know but like my really dear and like close friend of mine, Kamuta. She has known you since like she was a baby, and also Shanti Omkar as well. And I was like, that's so crazy that like, I don't know, like people that I didn't think would know each other like lived together and spent this time together, not in Sri Lanka or not in like Tirana. So this is
Well,
interesting.
here's the interesting, Kirthana, you'd love this. So the part of Nigeria that we lived in had a very, very tiny Tamil community. I would say maybe 30 families, 30, maybe 40 in the whole state, which is a massive area, right? Out of that Tamil community have emerged 3 journalists. Kumuda used to work for Bloomberg in London, and still does a lot of tremendous journalism work. Ashanti works for the BBC, and I worked for the CBC. And once in a while, we talk about what was in the water in my degree, Borno State in Nigeria, because it makes, like, I have, and considering that all of us heard that language around, most of us, or I think I can say Kumula and Ashanti probably did too, heard that language around don't be a journalist. Isn't that shocking that out of those 40 families, 3 journalists emerged? Anyways, it's kind of a neat little story.
It's also amazing that I guess the boats docking in BC at that time were kind of part of the spark for you. I think you guys both know the great book Sharon Baller wrote around boat people inspired by that. So just like an interesting thing as well. But I want to jump into now, you guys have talked about your journey and you guys are both at CBC. So how did you guys meet? Like, I know I shouldn't be foolish and be like, okay, there's 2 Tamil women that happen to work at CBC. They're going to find each other. But how did you guys find each other? And then how did that spark this idea of Boldly Asian once you guys did connect with each other?
Well, you wouldn't be wrong. There's 2 Tamil people at CBC, and then you just were like, oh my God, that name looks like mine. Selvarajah and Sasitharan are pretty, it's hard to miss, okay? You just count the syllables. Actually, I think what had happened was when I joined CBC, we were working on an investigation that Manjula had actually pitched to our newsroom around a temple that was withholding wages for artists, the Koburam artists. And so she had pitched that to our newsroom and we'd got in touch. And then I was doing translation work for the story because all the people in the story spoke Tamil. So I would watch the Tamil interviews and translate them in English. And so I remember that time, Manjula had messaged me and sent me an email. It's like, oh, hey, like I hear there's someone helping with this, like we should meet up. And then we didn't meet up because I think I started roving, like I started doing traveling Ontario as a reporter. I was living in like different cities. And then I'd come back periodically to Toronto in between my contracts in different cities. And I think we started really touching base when Manjula would host and I would be news reading our morning shows. That's where we really started developing a really beautiful friendship. And she was also hosting one of our weekend shows, and I would be news reading. And so we would always kind of touch base through that sort of communication. And so I think our brains just work the same way. It's funny if you ever, not that anyone's invited to this circle, but whenever Manjula and I just chat, we're like, okay, we're gonna like have a meeting today. Meeting starts at 9. Like our conversation about the topic starts at 9:45. From 9 to 9:45, it's like venting. It's like, what did your mom give you to eat? Well, I was like, I ate this. And then it's like, these are all the injustices in the world. This is what we need to solve. Oh my God, I forgot to do laundry. Like, and then it's like 9:45. So boldly Asian. And then I was like, after we lose 45 minutes. Well, don't tell the CBC, but we spent a lot of time chatting. But I think like with friendships, I think it's hard. I think when you're working on a series like this, something as vulnerable and something as powerful as this conversation, you need to really understand the people that you're working with, and you need to really be friends. You need to understand each other's languages. And I think Manjula always did that for me, and I hope I always did that for her as well. She was a soundboard. She was a friend. We were angry at the same things. We were excited by the same things. We kind of vibe that way. So what happened was one day during the pandemic, we were both working on our morning show. And for anyone listening, the morning show starts at 3 o'clock. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're drinking a coffee, you're coming into work. I'm news reading, trying to see what's breaking news, blah, blah, blah. By the time the shows are over, you're coming out of it around 11 o'clock. I think Manjula and I met each other at the elevators, and it was like, oh my God, this day is done. But it really just started to spark this conversation around, I love what we do. I love the opportunity that we do. What can we do that contributes to the narrative around journalism? What do we see missing? I mean, you got to remember, like, these are 2 Tamil women sitting in a room hosting and news reading, a huge audience. Like, this is pretty unprecedented. You don't really get this. It's especially, unfortunately, in today's day and age, we're still among the minority of on-air media. So what what can we leave? Like, what can we do to change the narrative? So we started to think about Asian Heritage Month. Every time Asian Heritage Month goes around, tell me how many press conferences come up, how many posts go on Instagram and Twitter. We wanted to switch that narrative. We thought it was so valuable to change how we view Asian Heritage Month. And I think that's really what sparked Boldly Asian. And I want Manjula to talk a little bit more about what Boldly Asian is for people who don't know, but it really came out of a conversation that we both had about what's missing in the current journalistic narrative that has to be told to get people to understand Asian communities a little bit better.
Manjula, do you want to take a crack at it?
Sure. Oh gosh, yeah. I have to say, it's funny to hear you say that your day's over at 11 a.m., but you're so right that the day would be, and some days that Kirthana and I would be coming in, there would be people still partying from the night before going home. That's tough to watch too. But I have to say, with the nice part about Boldly Asian was that it was something that we're really grateful that the people at CBC decided, our management at CBC decided to let us run with and to support. It was a series, it was multi-platform, so there was TV, radio pieces, digital pieces, and then it ended up that there ended up being pieces that went across the country as well. And the idea was we had these people, incredible people that we kept, and stories we kept coming across in the community who were change makers. But what they were trying to do is change the perception of something within the community and beyond. The best way to explain that would be, I think that you've interviewed Matusha Senthil, the founder of ThanePot, right? The founder of ThanePot. And what she was trying to do is get people talking openly and addressing the idea of sexual health, sex, and sex education openly in the community. So she's a change maker within the community, then within the South Asian community, which is the next level of onion skin, and beyond, right? So she would be an example of it. Another example of someone who would be a change maker was this organization we profiled, LGBTQ organization in the East Asian community based out of Toronto, and they had a program called Kirthana, correct me if I'm wrong. It's called When You're Ready, right? Is that right? Yeah, When You're Ready.
Yeah, when you're ready.
And the idea is that if you are a young person under the age of 30, East Asian, even younger than that, it ended up being, who is, you may realize that you fall into that definition, but maybe your family doesn't accept you. Maybe you don't know what to do next. You don't even know how to think about it. Should you come out? Should you not? Will you be, sort of left out of the community? What's going to happen? This is a safe, confidential space for you to come through a series of workshops and a little group that you can belong to that get you talking about what could happen. What are the finances you have to think about? What are the different aspects in your life that do you even want to do it? You don't have to do it. All of those things. And imagine that. Imagine being someone who's LGBTQ in the community. If you're worried that you're going to be left out of the community, even perhaps by your own parents, and having the space to talk about that openly. That's what they were running. So again, an organization that was making change within their community and beyond. And how we know it was beyond is we thought, well, this is kind of cool. Here's a change makers within communities and beyond. And we have, we had something like 15 stories. We picked the 5 best ones we could go with. And I think, if Kirthana, correct me if I'm wrong, it was like a minute after we started pitching it that someone in the room went, I love it. Someone with decision-making power said, I love it. I think we want to go with this.
And I think that I love it was, what was crazy about that I love it was how soon it came too much.
Yeah.
And I think it was funny because I've worked at CBC for so long and I never really realized that it's because they probably hadn't seen this. Like they were just amazed by the concept. Like, who comes in, 2 Tamil women, 2 Asian women come in to a room to pitch a story? Like, okay, that in and of alone is like, okay, that's unique. And then here's a concept that they wouldn't have come up on their own. You got to remember, journalism is very fast paced. The industry is fast paced. Sometimes the time it takes to develop ideas like this, think like this, can come from people who have lived experience or people who have ideas where that have been nurtured and talked about, which Manjula and I definitely had the opportunity to do with Boldly Asian. That was all of our Saturday morning chats. I spent more Saturday mornings with you than my partner. So it was lovely. It was great.
But I think the idea is to a certain extent, I think, Ara, this is why we need journalists from different communities in mainstream media, because I don't think, I mean, eventually, maybe a couple of years from now, or maybe a year from now, these stories may have made their way into media, but I'm not so sure. Right. But the interesting part about it is, take one of those stories, a group called Burnt Out Daughters, fabulous group for young women who felt like they, are feeling the pressures from every side about work, about family, about marriage, about everything. And they get together and they call themselves Burnt Out Daughters, and they have these great discussions. And I remember when we pitched this, I felt like all of the women in the room, despite their shape, size, or color, were like, yes, I think I'm a burnt out daughter too. And that was one of the stories that ended up going national. One of our very popular talk show programs, Ontario Today, actually devoted a talk show to it, brought the two founders of the group, because you understand, even though that organization is making change within the South Asian community, Burnt Out Daughters, any woman in any part of Ontario or Canada probably feels that pressure during the pandemic. So it really resonates. So I think I would have to say, my lessons coming out of this are kind of sort of three things, right? First of all, cultivate smart, savvy work friends that you can trust, right? Because and the reason that they're smart is that they elevate your game, which is what Kirthana does for me, right? Completely elevates my game. And I trust her. I can talk to her about the good stuff, the bad stuff, and the fresh ideas. So certainly cultivate work friends. Second thing I would say is take your moonshots, right? Don't think you can't walk into that room and suggest a big idea and gather up the rejections. Like you should, if at some point in your life, I heard this from someone this morning, you should have 50 rejections. If you don't, then how could you possibly have landed a moonshot, right? So Kirthana and I didn't think we would go in and it would land. It was just another pitch for us. We worked a lot on it. We spoke for about 2 months before we went into that room. But even after we got the yes, we got off the phone and went, was that a yes? Are you sure? I don't know. Maybe we should send an email, was our exchange, because we were used to hearing no's, and that's okay. So, get used to rejection. And I think that the third thing that you should think about is how your experience influences the work that you do, right? So, and that was the case for us. We decided that we had all of this knowledge that maybe was unique to the workplace we were in. So we decided to bring it to the workplace. So we bought new audiences, we bought new energy, and we managed to give these topics some coverage, which is it's like a win-win-win, really, right? So those are kind of the three things I would say that I'm sure Kirthana has something to add to that, but those are the three big things that I certainly learned from it.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, was how amazing that I think I really started to see response to our series when there was like, we had published a story and then there was a conversation that came out of that. There was a criticism. So I did a story on interracial marriages, and out of that story, there was criticism like, why is it only that interracial marriages with white people are portrayed? What about interracial marriage? And I was like, wow, like here's a conversation that, our story happened to feature Asian people who were in relationships with white people. But here's another conversation to have. Here's a whole other ball game: interracial marriage with communities that are non-white. And so I started engaging in this dialogue with people on Twitter, and that really solidified to me that we were making a difference. Here was the representation, and someone just craved more of it, and that really gave me a push. To be like, okay, we're on the right track. We're doing the right kind of journalism. This is attracting a different kind of audience. This is getting people to stick, because I knew that person who was commenting had already read a bunch of our stories because they were sharing them around. So now they're invested. And I loved seeing that reaction.
This episode is sponsored by nobody. That's right, nobody. So if you could be kind enough to hit that subscribe button, that would mean a lot to me. You kind of did the segue for me, because I was thinking about, when you're a creator, feedback is an important part of that creation process, right? Like, you put something out there, you want to know it's doing what you intended it to do. So, but before I do that, this is more of a quick comment, but as I think Manjula was talking about, or like both of you were talking about, the rejection process, it almost feels like if you want to be a journalist, a good first job, or a job when you're young, would be like door-to-door sales, or like some kind of sales job where
Yes.
I did sales when I was younger, and I still do it, but like I was really bad at, like, there's a lot of nuances to sales, but I feel like the one thing I got out of it is when someone rejects you or just says no, it's like, it's not the end of the world. Where like when you haven't experienced it before, you're like, oh, they said no, and like what am I going to do now? So it seems like that's like something I'm storing away in my head if there's a future journalist like in my family. But yeah, I want to go back to the idea of feedback as a creator. So, you know, you put these stories out there, you're getting feedback, and it kind of validates that you're kind of on the right path. You also got an award to, you know, celebrating the series you created. How did you feel about that award? Was that just like another positive piece of feedback that kind of just validated what you were doing, or like the icing on the cake, or was it something more? I'm just curious, like what your sentiment around getting that award was, and yeah, either one you can.
Manjula, I want Manjula to talk about this.
I want
she's-
Kirthana too. Come
Oh my
on, do
God.
it. Come on.
I think it was definitely not just validation. It was, you know what happens when you go to these award shows? They do a little snippet about your story, right? So here's another audience. Here's another 20,000, like 20 people, 30 people going to your story. Great. But, you know, I think it's typically in journalism, we do look at awards as validation. Award season comes around, it's a big deal. We're all sweating, rushing. But I think what solidified to me was that this was something that was totally new. This was something that was so unique. I think what was most important was our reaction from our senior producers and our execs, who were just like jumping for joy. They're like, oh my God, what the heck? Not that they didn't believe in our project, but trust me, awards are great. Okay, everyone loves awards. But that gave us a lot of strength. I'll be honest. I mean, being a journalist of color is sometimes you're always, like, this goes back to this idea of rejection. You're pitching stories that sometimes fit your bubble because you see the world in a bubble. You have a nuanced perspective on life. And sometimes those pitches don't work for the mainstream. Sometimes they don't work for the wider picture. Here's a series that probably didn't work for the wider picture, but it worked. And here's the validation to say, look what my work has created. Look what it has produced for you. An award. That's a representation of the investment that our corporation has put into our work. That's great. Here is that for you. For us, it just solidified that this work was important. It is worthy of this recognition. And here we need to make more of it. And that's what I think we gained the most out of that award. Yes, it looks great to write award-winning journalists. Trust me, I made pamphlets. I told everybody, but at the same time, I think it just solidified to me, our amazing colleagues, that just we need to invest in more journalism like this. We need to do more series-oriented ideas. We need to look at bigger picture and then break those down. And we need to talk to communities we would never otherwise talk to. That's what brought me the most excitement.
Manjula, do you have anything to add?
I just would like to echo everything. I think she captured it beautifully.
One thing before I go to the next question is, I should have asked this earlier, but you talked about getting rejected at kind of the newsroom, but for those of us who are not, don't have that privilege or opportunity to be in that room with you guys, what is that like? Is it like you two pitching in front of like 20 people? And like, how do they decide? Is it like there's one person that's like the master, like the master decision maker, or is it like you have to have a majority rules? Like, how does that work? I picture something like, you know, like when you're writing a TV show, something similar to that, but maybe not. I don't know. So you tell me.
Yeah.
It really depends. So it really depends on the pitch, right? So, you know, if you are pitching, so as an example, you know, you go in the morning and you pitch stories. You're all supposed to pitch stories in a newsroom meeting. That could be with 6 people, it could be with 10 people, right? You just really get used to pitching. Pitching is such a default thing we do now because you have to be ready. You pitch people in the elevator, you pitch people who are walking by, you know, in the kitchen. Of course, now it's all virtual, but the other way that it could look is it could be just you arranging a meeting with 3 or 4 people and pitching the idea. And sometimes it's you doing individual pitches to sponsors. Sometimes it's like cold emailing or cold calling people if you're doing it outside of the organization that you're with, right? So it could have all of these formats, but I would have to say that it helps if you're a good pitcher. Like if you're able to very briefly tell enough of the story that there's some tension, there's something in there that makes people go, oh yeah, like they're hearing it and they're going, yeah, that is relevant to something that's happening. It's timely, enough tension. There's something in there that just grabs them. And how sometimes you know it's a really good pitch is after you say it, everyone breaks out into an argument about it for about 10 minutes, right? So in the case in point, someone's like, well, why can't interracial marriages be this? Well, I don't know. Well, this, and then you're like, I think I've said my piece. Because what people have to understand with journalism is I think that people walk around thinking journalism informs. Certainly we do that, but we're also here to make you think about things. And if we can do that in that room, we know we can create that in a larger audience, right?
Kirthana, do you have anything to add on the perfect pitch and how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to add another strategy for pitching. If this is your crash course to pitching, folks, and this kind of works for us too. I think you start with a focus. What's your focus of your story? What's the focus of what you want to do? You write a headline. So what does the headline of your story look like? Here's the most important thing. You have 2 to 3 characters ready for your story. So when we did Boldly Asian, we made sure that we had our focus. Like think pitch. Like pitch is not so far. Like if you come from the business world, like bring some of those traits, that knowledge base, those skills to you could bring them to journalism. That's a very transferable skill. But having those characters or guests or knowing who you're going to interview for this story. So interracial marriage, we talk about 3 people who are in interracial marriages. Well, how do their narratives differ? What's the focus of the story? Why are we telling it? Here's the headline. These things really help to build a pitch because it really helps inform your team why we're doing this. But the most important thing, I sit in these early 9 a.m. meetings where everyone's half asleep, but everyone's ready to fight. And you're sitting there and I'm like, okay. And then you're hearing story. Sometimes there's complete silence. And that complete silence is not that people don't like your story. I kid you. It's Bob in the back is probably falling asleep because he didn't have enough coffee this morning. So, but it's one of those things that I have tried to not take personally during the pitch meeting. People are zoned out. But what makes people zone in is exactly what Manjula was saying, was this idea of like grabbing them in, making sure it's strong enough, making sure people understand why they need to care. If you can tell them why they need to care, that often rates a really quick response. Maybe it's an argument, maybe it's a conversation, maybe that conversation takes 20 minutes, but you know you've planted a seed. And if your idea and your pitch can plant a seed, it can often be very, very successful.
That's very similar to business when you're pitching a product. If
Exactly.
nobody is upset or like if they're not arguing about like what to do with your product, that means and they have no questions. It's often a bad sign. That's what I've learned. I thought no questions is great, but it's not. But I guess just to clarify, so you're pitching, but how does the actual decision of go or no, like how do you know if a pitch turns into a story or something you can work on? Like how does that process work?
I could just quickly say for us in our meetings, we need to get overwhelming majority in our meetings. There's usually about 20 people, and so if the majority of people like the idea, or and we can try to discuss where the story can go, how it translates, then the story goes ahead. But everyone has a say. Like they'll say, I don't think it's a good story. I don't think, if you're trying to hear quite a few notes, okay, we pass on it. We try to go back and develop it, or we drop the story. Again, remember, it's a very fast-paced industry too. So just always having a lot of pitches. Manjula, but you might have kind of a different subset.
Yeah, because Kirthana works more on the news side. I work more on the current affairs side. So I would say that in current affairs, it tends to be more about 6 to 8 people in the room. And what'll happen is everyone, when I used to be an associate producer on the morning show at CBC, everyone would come in with about 3 or 4 ideas, and then everyone would pitch them. And then when you pitch an idea, someone might add on something to it, right? So you might pitch an idea to say, I've just come across an international student who claims that there is an organization like an Indian restaurant in Brampton that owes her, that offered to pay her, under the table, and now owes her 8 months of, wages. And now she's almost ready to go out on the street because she comes from a poor family in the Punjab. That's the story. Then someone will go, oh, you know what? I know an organization. Someone will say, no, we've actually covered it this way. Or here's another angle. Why don't we bring in this charity to talk about it? And the idea grows, right? But what happens is that if I used to pretty much be in there every day pitching 3 to 4 ideas. So you learn to handle rejection, no problems, right? In those meetings, what would happen is, by the end of the meeting, if that story is going to fly or not, right? But I would say that that is a great way to rack up rejections. But I just generally think that it's kind of an interesting philosophy to maybe have, 1 year where you think, if you feel, or a period in your life, if you think that things are a little bit stable, you don't have a lot of strange things going on in your life, you feel like there's a little bit of emotional stability, tell yourself that you're going to rack up rejections this year. That could be asking for more pay, could be asking to be, included in the board of that organization, asking to that lovely person that you like for a date, whatever it is, right? Like you're just going to rack up a couple of like really amazing things that you want, and maybe make a bid for that condo that you wanted. And in our case, it would be, oh, maybe we'll pitch another idea for a series, and if it doesn't make it, that's okay, right? But do it at a time when it helps if you do it at a time when you feel like there's a little, if you're going to do that challenge of getting to 50, some people do getting to 100, then that might be a way to approach it, to make sure that you have a little bit of stability in your life.
Great advice. Thank you guys for satisfying my personal curiosity. To get back to the Boldly Asian series, you talked about, some of the impact and obviously winning the award. What does the future look like? I mean, you've done this series now, but obviously there's something there. What do you guys see as the future for this series, or is there some kind of permutation that you guys, have that you're thinking about?
Oh, TBD, I would say, right, Kirthana?
Yeah, definitely TBD. We're always looking for stories. We're always looking to tell people stories. I think what's beautiful about Boldly Asian, these aren't stories, like Manjula said, like you'd find. So we're keeping our eye out for more of these stories that we can develop into something. I think we're still coming off of all of the work that we've done last year, but it's TBD for sure. I think we're just waiting for more stories to pile in so we can keep the series going.
Yeah, we would love to hear more. If there are people out there that think that they have something to say, a story of this kind, please, we'd love to hear from you, because we hope that at some point we can continue this. I mean, it's a crazy year for the news cycle, that, Era, right? And but at some point we'd love to keep doing more of it.
Okay, well, the next topic I want to talk about is social media. Always a hot topic. Especially for folks that are in journalism. And I don't know I know some people have very strong opinions about it, but I look at social media as almost like a new media tool, right? It gives access to more people to express their views, whether it's good or bad or informed or not, but just to kind of let more people speak their mind. Do you see, like, I guess, number one, how do you see, like, what's your opinion on this? And number two, like, are there any trends similar to this that you see, going to the future in this, what they call the golden era of creators? So either one of you can jump on it. Did you know that every time you left a 5 out of 5 review for this podcast, a Tamil parent lets their child pursue a career in the creative arts? Okay, that's probably not true, but if there's a chance that it is, do you really want to jinx it? Leave a review. Do it for the young creative in you.
Social media and I have a very interesting relationship. I think recently so I actually a couple of years ago deleted my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. I deleted everything. This was while being a journalist, and trust me, that was very hard. But I was a roving reporter at the time, so I was in smaller stations, so I could pick up the phone, call people if I needed to get a story. I was in the middle of nowhere. I was driving on ice roads, so it was much easier to not have social media at that time. But I think now social media, this kind of relationship, I think as a journalist and social media has become one of, now I use Twitter, but it's become one of almost exhaustion. I find at a time where I would post about our stories and really let that narrative kind of juice and flow and move, now it's become a lot, and I'll be frank and honest here, a lot about defending journalism or kind of justifying journalism. I think people's perception of media has changed, and it's making it a little harder because it makes it so that you're struggling to sort of defend your career. Like you're struggling to tell people that I'm here, I'm a person behind the story. And this is everything that I do is valid. And so sometimes journalism has social media has transitioned from being this place of like, let's communicate our stories, let's have discussions, to a place of like defense and a wall. Like this tweet stands as its own statement, or this piece stands as its own part. And it sometimes becomes exhausting. I'm finding a lot of journalists making it a very conscious attempt to turn off their social media. And I'm definitely one of those. I'll go a couple of days without Twitter. I'll try to just disassociate completely. And it makes me feel freer, but it makes me a better journalist, I think. By taking yourself away from media, you're really taking yourself away from narratives around media. You're keeping yourself sane for your actual job and the work and the accountability that you do, which is what I want to do. I want to hold people accountable. I want to speak truth to power. I want to tell stories that are untold. I don't want to get caught up in the narratives that make me exhausted or make me think about why I'm exhausted as a journalist. So anyways, that's my personal experience with social media. I don't mean to make it a downer, but I think it's important to be real about kind of all the facets of what it offers to people as journalists, but also what it does to us as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that when I was thinking, I actually had to think really deeply about if we are creators, because I don't think I've reached a decision on that, if we are creators, because I see the people that I can think of that are creators have decided that here's the objective for what I need to do, here's how I'm going to be compensated for it, and here are the mediums I'm going to use to get there. That's not what we do, right? In a way. So I think I still have to decide if we fall into that realm. But I second everything that Kirthana has said about how it can be exhausting. So I'll say, my goodness, I agree with all of that and more. And I do think that you, like, I try now consciously to take a day off on the weekends. I know that a lot of my colleagues do as well, where they actually turn things off completely. But on the other side of things, I also find that it is an interesting place to find opinions and voices, because in a way, it democratizes the ability to speak. Like it gives you that soapbox to sit on, right? The problem with the soapbox, I think, is not just when it comes to social media, but just even across the web, is who owns the purse to who distributes it, and who has editorial content. right? And that, I think, is a concern. And then, so eventually it becomes a little bit of everyone has their own facts, everyone has their own filter bubble, and they are choosing to live within that bubble. And whoever has the right resources, has the right team sitting in some office in the middle of nowhere and can tweak the algorithms to work better for them, can get that particular version of facts out there. And I think that is a concern, right? We're seeing that that work out in so many different realms. I mean, there's been conversations about how that might be happening with international conflicts, with thinking around the vaccines, all those areas. So I think there is a larger concern around that. But I will just say one little line as a technology columnist that I find interesting, because you asked for what the future vision would be. I think everyone thinks about how are we going to disrupt media, but what really needs to be thought out is how are we going to disrupt the business model for media. So I'm going to show you something. I got people who are listening may not be able to see this, but someone in the house bought an antique item secondhand. We're really into buying secondhand, and it came wrapped in a newspaper. And it ended up being, Kirthana, you're going to love this, 1957 London Free Press. That's what it was wrapped in.
Our weird selves would just frame that.
It's so, like, I've stacked it, so I've got it all stacked here, and it's 1957, and there are ads. Like, it's so noticeable. There are tons of ads in here. But if you compare it to my Globe and Mail that I receive, there's almost no ads in the Globe and Mail. Well, who's paying for this stuff, right? And you brought up the idea of Substack. I mean, Substack has come up with this method of having people individually pay. You want to get the next chapter of Salman Rushdie's novel, you get it on Substack, you have to pay, you have to subscribe to it. So I do think that we are going to see people come up with different and clever ways to address the issue of the business model. But I think that we do have to remember, think about this idea of editorial control, and think about this idea of having an authority that actually curates the news for you, so that you're not just listening to mining news, Kirthana isn't just listening to technology news, and I'm just not listening to news about the Raptors, that I'm getting a little bit of everything and staying informed, and it's passing through this massive editorial process. I'm sorry I took up so much time with that, but I had to get that across because it is something that I think a lot of people think about, not just journalists, right?
I'm just wondering why I got the mining news and not the Raptors. But
I don't know. I'm sorry. You.
Do I look like someone that reads about mining? But okay.
I wanted to quickly add something to Manjula. It's also, I think, what you have to look at the future of who is going to be a journalist too, because what journalists used to be and how you became it has changed. There is a media organization called The Conversation Canada, which has academics writing kind of like news articles. They're writing their research like a news article. Are they a journalist or are they an academic? So when you're thinking about the future of media, you're thinking about what method does media take in the future. You also have to ask yourself, who is a journalist and who is characterized as a journalist? What mediums are considered journalists? Just want to put that thought out there.
Yeah,
and just as a side note, the conversation is actually a great place to read up on different sort of the work of academics, right? And they do have, an editorial team and everything. But I agree, Kirthana, like that is a really interesting format too.
Yeah, no, I had a few thoughts as I heard you guys speak about social media as well, where my viewpoint on social media is it's kind of like a tool, like driving a car. I feel like I think we're all part of that weird group that knew what the world looked like before social media and like learned to live with it. But this new generation of like I look at younger people, all they know is social media, and I feel like they need to be better trained in how to consume that information because it could be very unhealthy. Like I look at social media as a place to kind of get inspired, like you, I think Manjula, both of you mentioned, like to find inspiration, but I also find it could be a potential time suck. It's almost like I start to eat a bag of chips, and that's what social media is. I'm like, I want to look for inspiration. I'm going to have a couple of bites, and within an hour, I've ate the whole bag of chips, and I'm like, what happened? And that's what social media is. Like, I think I'm using it responsibly, but it just built in a certain way. The people that build it, design it, know how to build it so that even people that are like us that are aware still end up using it more than we want to. And I think that's why I've heard of this concept called the tech Sabbath a bit more. It's kind of borrowed from Christian practice of the Sabbath, but like tech Sabbath. And I think there's an author, I heard his name, Neil something, Book of Awesome. I think he does this. And it's just like crazy how your brain gets rewired from that one day of just stepping away from technology. So that's interesting. Another quick thing I'll mention is, I think you talked about the future of creators or like who's paying for the content. And I think The Athletic, they were touted like when they started as, okay, it's going to be great content. There's going to be no advertising, only subscribers pay for it. And I think the CEO at some point said, hey, we're going to like keep doing this until we're going to wait for all the traditional media companies like the New York Times, et cetera, just to die out. And I think just like 2-3 weeks ago, the New York Times actually bought The Athletic, which I thought was funny. So I don't know if I thought The Athletic could work and it had a great kind of idea or like potential, but that kind of leads to the next question I had, which is, I've noticed more and more journalists with large enough followings leaving big incumbents because I was listening to your process of, I think my personality is if I have an idea, I want to do it. I don't want someone to tell me if I can do it or not. I'll figure out a way to do it, but I realize it's not a possibility. But I've noticed more journalists leaving big companies like the New York Times, Toronto Star, etc., to either be independent or join more nimble organizations. And Substack is one tool, Ghost, and like a bunch of other things they do. I think there's a guy who covers the MMA. He started independent, then he worked for ESPN, then he went back, I forgot his name. So at CBC or like just like people you interact with, do you see this trend continuing of this talent of, good journalists with big followings that have great ideas, leaving places like the CBC, the Toronto Star, to join Substack or just do other things that are, or even like leave altogether and do work for corporate, like do marketing or communications for like a big tech company. So what are your thoughts around that? I said a lot, so just
No, that's okay. Go
do you
ahead,
want to go,
Manjula.
Kirthana? I'll give it a stab. It's interesting because I think that in every profession you have people that that belong to large accounting consulting firms or consulting firms period that decide then, oh, I'm going to go just do my work for one client, or I'm going to form something and do it independently, right? I think that there will always be people making decisions. I don't think that there is, certainly we've had some really, really, you've heard of people starting really large podcasts, you've heard of people starting massive newsletters, but I think that there will always be a stream of people in any profession that decide that they want to move on and do different things, maybe focus in on an area. And some of that stuff is incredibly innovative. I mean, you mentioned The Logic, that focuses in on technology and does a fantastic, they've actually broken some really large stories, technology stories in Canada. So, there was a gap, they identified it, and they're doing great work, much needed work, right? So I think that there will always be that. You also have to remember that this is a profession where when it comes to employment, there is a lot of incredibly smart supply more than demand. So when that exists, people always look for other things that they can do. So I mean, because of some large departures, people may think that it's a trend. I think it's part of it has always been there.
I also want to add, like, we are in the pandemic, and it's never been a more exhausting time to be a journalist in a big city, like in Toronto. It's not because of it's maybe not because of journalism, but it's because of the work that you're watching press conferences every day, you're following everything. It's exhausting. I can speak as someone who has worked in a bit, like I started in Toronto. I chose to go to Sudbury, and someone would say, you had a gig here, why did you leave? Like, I was working with the National Investigative Unit. I had a sweet gig as a National Investigative Unit and left that to be a reporter in Sudbury. I had a couple of people say, what the heck is wrong with you? Like, you literally got the prime gig. I did that because I needed to have that experience from my personal growth. That's where I had an appreciation for what people value in small communities. I got to work with Indigenous communities. That's the first time I remember standing at the corner in Sudbury, and at all three of the corners, 3 people were lying on the ground because of an overdose. And at the same time, 3 ambulances came to all 3 intersections and were trying to revive them. I never would have seen that. And actually, that was in Thunder Bay. But I remember I never would have seen that if I was in Toronto. I am blinded by the tall buildings and my Union Station and going around the corner and my pathways and my cars. I don't need to see that. When I'm working in these small towns, do I have, and I hate to call them small towns because I don't want to diminish the work that they do. These are just smaller regions. But people leave, I think, 1, because they want personal growth. 2, because they need to get out of their heads. I think I needed to leave to get out of my head. I could have been an investigative journalist. I loved it. It was a great gig. I was working on a huge national investigation, but I couldn't feel as satisfied as the time I was in Thunder Bay and my boss said, hey, there's a new crosswalk opening. Could you go do that story? I was like, why the heck am I doing a story about a crosswalk? He said, come in here. And he said, this intersection has had a couple of accidents. There was a couple of kids involved. This crosswalk means so much to them. And that's when I realized, who am I with my privileged Toronto perspective to come in here and devalue
Money
a story
can be hard
about
to
a
come
new
by,
crosswalk?
but here's a $100 opportunity for you. Join my free newsletter for free exclusive content and a free chance to win $100 when I hold special draws.
Smaller
Did I mention
media
that it's
because
free?
they get to do bigger stories. They have their creative freedom. Sometimes we're confined to the 6 o'clock deadline. You know, I'm filing. I'm wearing a blanket over my head, trying to voice my item to make sure it gets on TV. Do I need to do that, or can I look into, you know, something that's happening at a school in a small part of northeastern Ontario that I get 2 or 3 days to really develop that story and what impact that has. I remember when I was in Thunder Bay, I did this incredible story about they sang they translated the national anthem into Ojibwe. And I spoke to this kid. I remember his name. His name was Josh, and he was in grade 11. I said, "What does this mean to you to do this?" He said, "My grandmother never got to do this, so I'm going to do it for her." And I sat there and I was like, "Okay, wow!" Like, I wouldn't have got that narrative sitting in my newsroom in Toronto because I'm clouded by this camera goes here, this camera goes here. So anytime a new journalist comes in, I always say, "Go. You want to stay here, stay here. Don't worry. But if you can go now. Go when you can. Get up, go. You are fine. You can be away from your family for 2 months. Ramen noodles taste just as good. Like, just leave." And I know an incredible journalist. I encouraged her to go. She actually got a job in Calgary. She's a video journalist now. She started with us in Toronto, but I said, you have so much potential, and she's thriving. And I'm so proud of her. But I want to put this attention on, I think you see people leaving and having these big departures, but I think there's so much value in your personality and the way you think of yourself as a journalist, to what you offer to the table and what people give you when you start to depart and leave from your cushy mainstream sort of sabbaths.
The other thing too is, I think that, you know, when I look at the people in the CBC newsroom, I mean, my goodness, there are a ton of people that are super savvy, right? Kirthana, you can say that too. Like, we work with some really smart people that have also a range of other hobbies. Like, Kirthana is, you know, a fully trained Bharatanatyam dancer. There's someone over there who sings opera, someone over here, you know, who's a jazz musician. Like, people are capable of all these very interesting things and also knowledgeable about city and provincial and Canadian affairs. But, you know, one thing I would say is that they're also really great storytellers. They can work to a deadline. They are hardworking. How could that not be? So I could understand that at some point someone goes, want to come work for me? And it becomes appealing to go, oh, I'm going to, like, I went from doing something that I loved, that I was, you know, pretty good at, to this. So similarly, people could go, what are you doing switching to journalism? It's the same thing. At some point you think, oh, I think I want to change. But that that idea that you are hardworking, capable of working deadlines, and you can put together this wonderful narrative is an amazing skill for a ton of things.
Great. I really like that story you talked about, Kirthana, the one with Josh. I feel like if he told that to me, I would have cried on the spot.
Oh my gosh. It
Yeah.
was the power to not
Yeah.
cry. He was the most eloquent grade 11 student. I actually saw him at a powwow the week after, and I was going to go up to hug him. And my boss was like, that's weird. I was like, okay, I will do it.
I would love to get both your perspectives on, so you're going to get into a time machine and visit your 16-year-old selves. What would you tell them?
I tell them, don't listen to Amma. Go to do journalism. You're not gonna die. No, but seriously, I think literally my Amma is sitting there and she's like, they're gonna kill you. I was like, who? They're like, they will kill you. But seriously, I would just tell myself that I think one thing I struggled with when I was a kid was I didn't trust myself, and I didn't trust my talent to be a journalist. I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I had a skill. I thought I had to do something to do that. I let some of that clouded judgment from my mother and my own self-doubt really set in. But I think if I could go back to my 16-year-old self, I would tell myself, you're smarter than you think because you're curious. Use that curiosity and really capitalize on that. Because had I become a journalist early on, I think I would have spent a lot more time traveling. I would have spent a lot more time elsewhere. I love the trajectory of my life. I wouldn't change it the way that it went, but I'd want myself to know. I want myself to trust their curiosity.
You're up, Manjula.
Oh my, this is a very tough question in terms of advice, because I feel the same way that I like the trajectory my life is taken. So the funny thing is the advice offering is actually the opposite of the trajectory that my life has taken. I would probably say to that 16-year-old to take it easy a little. You've got a lot of time. There's a lot of time when you're 16. I would say that as you get older and you approach your 20s, start to hone in on one thing and know that that one thing comes with a lot of massive ups and downs, but eventually it'll settle. But I had a conversation recently with someone about really focusing in on one thing and finding your edge. And I would say that's what I would tell, maybe not the 16-year-old, because I want the 16-year-old to explore a little, but I would tell the 20-year-old to say, take it easy, but focus in on something that is a combination of a bit of your interest, but a bit of what you're great at, and then hone in on that. And that'll be the thing that every couple of years you'll get better at, and will work out for you, will become one day far more enjoyable, far more easier to do, and pay back in so many ways.
Good advice. And now we're looking forward. So in terms of personal legacy, how would you both want to be remembered by your friends and family?
That's a difficult question. My goodness. I got to think about that a little. Kirthana, you got something that surfaces?
I actually don't know how I want. I think I'm privileged to say that being a journalist allows me to leave a legacy. My name is in print. My name, you can Google me, and I have, tons of Google hits that pop up. That's a legacy. That's a traditional form of legacy. I think not even just as a journalist, I am a Bharatanatyam dancer. I'm going to do my Arangetam, which is your final graduation for dance. That's part of my legacy too. My mom never got to do her Arangetam because she was living in Sri Lanka at the time. My legacy from my family is doing my Arangetam so that they could say someone in our family did finished our Tamil art form and completed it. And here is my daughter who was able to do what I couldn't do. That is part of my legacy. As a journalist, I think in many ways, my legacy is the stories that I do, ensuring that I have done stories that make people feel represented, make people feel like they have been heard, that that me telling their story made them feel like they can open up. They don't have to hold back. They don't have to feel like they need to be sensitive about it. I hope that's the legacy I leave with people, and I hope my parents remember that. I know my parents didn't understand journalism when I got into it. I think it was later on that my dad took a lot of pride. It's funny, like my dad would say, "Oh, my daughter works for CBC," and they were like, "Oh, I love CIBC. I'm bank with them too." And I'm like, "What?" And I was like, "Why would you bank with?" And then my dad's like, "No, CBC." He's like, "What?" The red logo, and I'm like, "Oh my god, okay, this is embarrassing at this point." But now I think it's come into more of a mainstream. But it was a hard conversation. But I think the legacy comes with the stories that I get to share. I get to do a story about Madhya a few years ago, and I'm so proud of that story. It was hard because I remember my mom was in Sri Lanka at the time, and I couldn't share the story with her because it was a little bit of tension. But doing that story about Madhya, I got everyone in my newsroom to say Madhya, and it was so interesting because I was like, oh my God, okay, this is so weird. But those little bits, I think, are my legacy, that I got to bring a bit of my natural, authentic self to my newsroom. And in the same way, my parents get to say, a part of who we are lives in this visceral universe. I think those are kind of ways.
You ready, Manjula?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I have a couple of thoughts on this. I don't know if I am wed, I don't want to say that I don't care, but it's not that I don't feel this pressure or this sense that I want people walking around remembering who I am. I just don't think it happens to anyone, right? There's just too much content, too many people, frankly, right? But there are a couple of things that I would like to leave in my wake, let's put it that way, right? One thing is to raise a child that has, is socially conscious. That's really important for me. That's one very powerful thing that motivates me. The second thing that I would really like to I think I'm actually starting to almost move into that phase of my life, thinking about what I'm going to leave in my wake, is to have other women, younger women, have a little bit of an easier path than I may have had in certain areas, right? And it's something that came to me in the middle of the Me Too movement about 3 or 4 years ago. And I thought, well, what have I done? I've done nothing. And that's where Tamil Women Rising came about, in the middle of the Me Too movement. This, I am doing nothing. What have I done for other women? I've just gone on and really just thought about myself. I had this 3 or 4 nights where this is all I thought about, and then basically called a whole bunch of people, and they said, well, we're going to come on with you. And we started this. And even though we're still trying to figure out how to do it right, I think that I want to, over the next couple of years, spend some time figuring out a way to create systems that'll make the path easier for other women to be successful. So it's not a matter of a legacy, but at least it's a better wake and a better path than what I found. And I think especially for women of color, and including Tamil women, obviously.
I just want to add here quickly that Manjula does this all the she is someone that honestly, truly, I don't care if she could laugh, she could be like, oh my God, don't say this, I'll say it anyway. She honestly does step up for so many people. She will do, I think, the time, this woman, I don't know if you guys actually understand this, but she does so much. She's actually in so many different circles. She takes on so many beautiful tasks, and she's very well known in her circles. But the time she takes for people is crazy. The time she'll take out of her day just to hear me just go blah, or the time she'll take to push someone else forward or really ensure that they get the better understanding. She really puts things into perspective. She really always helps people put things into perspective. She's one of the most
okay, I have to stop you. Stop. You can't say this.
I'll end on this. I will end on this. You must always find someone who motivates you, who helps you be the best version of yourself. And I think Manjula does that with me. And I know she does that with other women. I've seen her at a Tamil Women Rising event. And I think that is a legacy that carries because of the impact you've had on other people's lives. I think that in and of itself is a legacy.
So I'm going to tell something here, a story, right? That I think kind of talks about what Tamil women do for each other, because I think sometimes we're this silent network that people don't know exists, right? That temple story that Kirthana mentioned. The reason I pitched the story is because there was a Tamil woman who found out about it, who had all the contacts that she had within the CBC, but decided to call me and I'm not going to reveal her name because I don't have the permission to, but called me and said, not only do I trust you because you're a Tamil journalist, but I'm hoping that by you pitching the story, it'll further your career. So even though she had more direct, more well-known journalists that were not Tamil, she could have taken the story to, she was like, who's the first Tamil journalist? I'm going to use this as a way to further your career. And what people don't know about the Tamil community is they find Tamil journalists and they will find ways to gently push your career forward. And Tamil women are notoriously great at doing this for each other, right? So it's just, I think in a way, I feel like I have to kind of put my time in now doing that, right? So hopefully over the next decade.
I think you're on your way based on Kirthana's testimony. And I think that's a beautiful way to kind of segue into the final segment of the podcast. It's a fun speed round. I like to call it Creator Confessions. I'm going to say a bunch of statements, and you're going to say the first thing that pops to mind. And just for consistency's sake, we'll always start with Kirthana and then Manjula, just so people know who's responding. So, you guys ready?
Okay.
All right. Favorite Tamil food?
Kothurati.
Appam.
Something that scares you?
The horror films.
All scary movies, every single one of them.
Insecurity that you have?
The way I look.
Yeah, actually the way I look too.
Favorite show you're watching?
Arthur. Binge watching Arthur.
I love that show as a kid.
Where do I start? I have so many on the go. Gosh, binge watch. What are we watching now? Oh, a Superstore.
A place you're itching to travel to after this pandemic is over, managed, whatever you want to call it.
Morocco.
Spain.
Favorite childhood memory?
Oh my God. I don't know. Favorite childhood memory. Oh my God, is that sad? I don't have one. No, okay. I think it's probably my parents took me to a water park for my birthday. That was a fun memory.
For me, it would be my parents told me that they hate pets inside the house, but they told me that if I studied hard enough, I could get a kitten, and then they didn't come through for ages. And then one day they just showed up with a kitten and agreed to live with a kitten inside our house, which they both hate. So for me, that is like the best gift that I could have ever received. And it's just was such a big moment in my life. I can't even tell you, but yes, that is my finest moment as a child.
Something you like to do for fun outside of work?
Cook. I love to cook.
Yeah, same here. I love cooking. This is
what
why
you
we
guys-
get along.
Yeah, I was
I
gonna say.
know.
Favorite movie of all time?
A Tamil or English? Okay.
Either or.
Tamil movie Chandramukhi. English movie is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban.
I'm not going to go for a movie. I'm going to instead say a series because I practically watch it every year. It's Pride and Prejudice. Yeah, like I've watched it more times than I should actually probably say. Yeah, it's a BBC series, the original BBC series. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
A purchase you've made that you've splurged on in the last couple of years that you have zero regret about?
my rent, the roof over my head.
Zero regret. Oh my gosh. That I have zero regret? I have a ton of regrets. What are you talking about?
Essentially a guilt-free large purchase or significant purchase that you have no guilt about, or
And it could be a moment or
yeah,
an
it could be
experience.
anything.
Yeah, we went on a trip to Italy with a bunch of friends, and it was pricey, and we rented a place together, a villa together. I didn't even know that I would do this at one point in my life, but I can be completely pretentious and say we did. And it was amazing because I got to spend some really quality time with my friends. And one of those friends then ended up actually moving away to London. So it's kind of this massive memory, but it was such an amazing experience, just the time together, and the country so beautiful. And you forget how historical, like the amount of history in Italy too. But I would say that was a splurge well worth it.
Pet peeve.
Oh,
Pet peeve.
Pet peeve. I'm trying to think. I actually have so many that I'm trying to nail down. Pet peeve is people that are not kind. I really value kindness, but people who want to have an attitude or want to bring an attitude to the table, I hate people who are not kind. It's one of my biggest pet peeves.
Oh my God, I have so many too. Like, some of them are as small as like when you don't have winter tires. I can't stand that.
Don't talk to my dad.
I would say pet peeves. People who anger easily, I think. People who like, they don't kind of wait to listen and kind of hear I can't. And I've been noticing, sometimes I notice people, and I know that everyone's under a lot of stress, and I notice that happening in the pandemic sometimes, at places, at malls and stores, and I can't stand it. And I have to actually not get angry as fast enough with them either, right? But I've always not really liked people who get angry very fast.
If you were going to die tomorrow, a regret that you would have.
That I never got to send my parents on a Canada-wide train trip. That's my number one goal in my life.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't really thought that one out. That's such a massive question. These are supposed to be like, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream?
I think you know the answer, but you're overthinking it. I think you have an answer.
I think it would be a whole bunch of regrets around my daughter. Yeah, I can't pinpoint on it, because the only thing that emerges, my poor other half doesn't make it into the picture. I care about him too, but it's just like, it's all kind of taken over with everything about my daughter that I can't pinpoint one thing, but everything about like what I could have done with her, what I should have done with her, everything. So
a celebrity or just a person that you would be interested in living or experiencing what they go through for one day?
Oh, that is a good one. Kamala Harris, definitely. I don't know why I thought of that for so long. Kamala Harris, for sure. Yeah.
Kamala Harris would be a good one. I can't think of anyone that I would want to live for a day. Angela Merkel, maybe? I don't know. It would have to be a politician, I think.
Oh yeah, she's a baddie. She's awesome.
Yeah, I would think Merkel, or who else? Yeah, someone I think who does like an insane amount in a day, and I just don't get. Oh, you know who would be really great too? The guy who wrote *Sapiens*, the author.
Oh, yeah, I forget his name.
Yuval Harari, I think. I just once heard an interview with him, and he just sounds like a real fascinating person. I think he would be someone I would just want to know what he sort of how he goes about his day and how he comes up with these sort of massive ideas.
A book or podcast that you've consumed in the last year or two that's had an impact on you?
Actually, ironically, The Boat People, huge impact on me, and really really, I think sparked a light in me to really reappreciate my culture.
Have you interviewed her yet, Ara?
Sharon, yes, I did. She was 3 or 4 episodes ago.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, I've
Yeah.
got to make a point of listening to that. I think she's fascinating. Book is I think it's called Empire of Pain. I just read it. It's about the opioid crisis and the pharmaceutical and sort of the everything that brought it about and the tie to sort of pharmaceutical companies. It's beautifully written. It's written by a journalist. It's now an award-winning book, but it is absolutely shocking. And to a certain extent, you read it and it speaks to so much. There's so many failings in regulatory bodies and in the justice system. There's so many things that it's really, I would highly recommend this read as just I think people need to be aware of where things are with the opioid crisis and also how much it's costing us, right? But it's a beautifully written book too.
A belief, behavior, or habit that has improved your life.
Right after you shower and put on your clothes, taking 5 minutes to sit on your bed and breathe, and then you start your day. That's changed my life.
7 to 8 hours of sleep.
And finally, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
7 to 8 hours. I'm telling you, the way your brain works after, if you can do it. I know you have young kids, Sarah, so you can't get to that yet, but one day, it's incredible. Yeah.
And finally, a piece of advice that you guys would give to your fellow aspiring Tamil creators out there. I know Kirthana kind of touched on this with advice, but maybe specifically around, especially if you're doing something that's unorthodox or where it's not really something where you can get predictable income. How do you plan finances to be able to do that thing? So maybe that, but that was just kind of a suggestion, but whatever you think somebody listening to this could use that word of encouragement or advice.
Your parents love you, but your parents aren't always right. Sometimes we grow up conditioned to believe that their say is go, but they haven't seen the world that we live in. And one day they'll understand that. So keep doing what you want to do, but bring them along for the ride so they understand every step of the way, so that they don't feel like that success wasn't also there. I think that's something that I've tried to bring my parents along for the ride with my successes, so I can remind them every single moment that every yes you gave me is what brought me to this point.
Love that.
You have to remind me of the question. I got so absorbed in Kirthana's answer.
Yeah, that was a great answer.
Kirthana, that was a great answer. Oh my gosh, that was so moving. Okay. What was the question again?
Oh, sorry, just like a piece of advice that you would give an inspiring, Tamil creator out there. Just something that might encourage them or, yeah.
I would say grow really tough skin. Because when you are someone that puts out things, whether you're doing it for a large organization or you're doing it independently, you're going to hear all sorts of things, comments back at you. You're also going to have a lot of highs and a lot of lows. So work on growing your thick skin, because if you're going to do it for 2 years and it'll help you stick to doing it consistently, because doing it consistently is what gets you there, right? Riding through the thicks and thins, the ups and downs. And the downs are sometimes driven by people giving you either not caring about your work or giving you, terrible advice when they shouldn't, or just, bad feedback. So you want to make sure that you ride through those things.
Great. No, that was awesome. Well, that's the end of the podcast, guys. That was amazing. Both of you guys had amazing answers, and Kirthana, talk about ending off things with a bang. That was a great answer. For people listening that listen to this and were inspired or want to connect with you guys, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Definitely Twitter. My DMs are open. I love chatting with people. Or LinkedIn. I'm kind of old school. I like my LinkedIn.
Same thing here. Either LinkedIn or Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again for jumping on and making time and being part of my pilot project of dealing with multiple guests. I appreciate it. And for those of you listening, as always, appreciate it and look forward to the next episode.